Have you ever heard about Jael, an ordinary woman with no military training, who defeated one of the most feared commanders of her time? Jael's story is both surprising and challenging, as it goes against almost everything we think about courage, strength, and purpose. In a world where oppression seemed invincible and where no one would expect such an attitude from a housewife, Jael proved that even the most unlikely can be the chosen one. Her victory is not just an ancient passage, it is a lesson in faith and courage that speaks directly to the heart of those who have felt powerless in the face of their own challenges. Do you believe that God can use you for a greater purpose? Jael was used just like that, and her action has resonated throughout the centuries. If you've ever wondered how to face your own giants, or how to find strength in times of doubt, Jael's story brings unexpected and powerful answers. Jael, an ordinary woman living in a scenario dominated by fear and war, represents a figure who surprises and inspires over the centuries. At a time when the power and oppression of kings and commanders were constant, she, who lived in a simple tent, did not hesitate to put herself in a position of action in the face of danger. Her courage in facing the commander Sisera did not come from the fact that she was a warrior or held any title of authority. She was not even part of the leaders expected by the people of Israel. Her strength, in fact, came from a source that many underestimate, an unwavering faith that gave her the audacity to go above and beyond what anyone would expect from someone like her. It is inspiring to realize how a person can be called to a greater purpose, even if it goes against expectations. When Jael found herself face to face with Sisera, a man of power feared by many, she did not hesitate to do the unthinkable. Many in her place might have chosen to retreat simply out of a sense of security or to preserve the peace that her husband Heber had established with King Jabin, an ally of Sisera. But Jael saw in that instant an opportunity that transcended her own life and personal convenience. Her faith pushed her forward, giving her courage in a way that only those who are willing to trust in something beyond themselves can understand. How many times do we find ourselves in situations where everything seems to tell us to give up? Jael's story shows us that sometimes we need to be the instrument of change ourselves, even if the whole world tells us otherwise. Imagine the context: a woman on a battlefield where she shouldn't even be, involved in a conflict that seemed not to be hers. However, Jael was there, motivated by something much greater than her own safety. She reminds us that you often don't have to be an obvious hero to be an agent of transformation. Jael's courage was a reflection of her faith and her willingness to serve a greater purpose, a purpose that she perhaps did not fully understand. This is, in fact, a sign of true faith, a faith that works even when you don't have all the answers. How often do we think that only great leaders or those in positions of influence can make a difference? Jael proves that it only takes a heart full of courage and faith to change an entire story. The transformation that Jael brought to Israel at one of the most critical moments in its history is not only a heroic narrative, but a powerful message about obedience and purpose. Rather than omit herself, she accepted the call to do what many would consider unthinkable. And this type of action does not come without sacrifice, without risk. In moments of doubt or fear, it's easy to get carried away by the idea that our small contribution won't make a difference. But Jael teaches us the opposite, that even silent actions, hidden from the public, have the power to generate impact. His choice was driven by a courage that came from faith, and it is this kind of courage that we often lack to face our own daily Siseras. The scene is almost cinematic. Sisera, exhausted and confident, enters Jael's tent, believing he is safe. She welcomes him with kindness, offers him shelter, but her mind was fixed on the greater purpose. Jael knew that this moment was unique, an opportunity that God had placed before her to bring deliverance to his people. This kind of courage requires one to renounce one's own comfort zone, one's own interests, and embrace a path that may even seem insane in the eyes of the world. However, Jael did not act to impress. She acted out of obedience, out of a faith that propelled her to something far beyond her own survival. Your courage is a reminder that God often acts in the most unlikely situations and people. Jael then became the heroine that no one expected. The people of Israel did not count on her, did not see her as a figure of salvation, but history showed that she was just what the people needed. It is interesting how, in our own lives, God puts us in situations where no one believes in our potential, where even we ourselves doubt our ability to act. But like Jael, we are all capable of being agents of change. The important thing is that we are willing to act when the moment arises, even if it means defying the expectations of others. And for that, it takes a courage that comes from faith, a faith that is willing to obey without questioning the wise. Jael's choice to act reveals that true faith is not just about words or prayers, but about firm actions at critical moments. The faith that Jael possessed was a faith that not only believed in a God of righteousness, but that was willing to act to make that righteousness manifest. She understood that her purpose in that moment was something bigger than herself, and in doing so, she set a powerful example of how obedience can transform situations of oppression into liberation. Even if we face pressure or criticism, authentic faith manifests itself when we have the courage to do what is right, even when we have no guarantees of success. This first courageous act of Jael just begins a journey that shows how an ordinary woman can be the protagonist of a story of victory and liberation. Jael's faith, courage, and obedience opened the door for Israel to experience God's justice in a way no one could have imagined. And just as their action triggered a series of transformative events, our own decisions to act with faith and courage can also be catalysts for change, even if we don't initially see the impact it will have. Jael did not have swords or armor, but a simple everyday object, a tent stake, something that to anyone else might seem harmless. By choosing this common tool, she demonstrated that even the most humble instruments can be transformed in the hands of those who have faith. The Bible teaches us that God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the strong, 1 Corinthians 1:27. And so it was with Jael. God used her to show that it is not the weapons that make the warrior, but the courage and purpose in the heart of the one who acts. The stake in Jael's hands became a symbol of deliverance and justice, a sign that even what seems simple or even fragile can, in the right hands, be an instrument of victory. While Sisera slept, Jael made use of this everyday object to change the course of history. With uncommon courage, she approached and quickly and precisely drove the stake, defeating the one who oppressed her people. As we read at Judges 4:21, then Jael, the wife of Eber, took a stake from the tent, and taking a hammer, quietly approached him and drove the stake into his temple until it went through his head and into the ground. This passage reveals to us a daring but also strategic act of a woman driven by the conviction that her action was part of a greater purpose. Jael's act reminds us that with God, even what seems improbable can become a path to victory. This act was a sign of how God, in His sovereignty, chooses the most unexpected people and instruments to fulfill His designs. Jael was far from a warrior or someone with military training, but God does not require external qualifications to use someone. The Lord does not see as man sees. A man sees the appearance, but the Lord sees the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. He found in Jael a willing heart, a heart that even in its simplicity carried faith and obedience. This truth echoes in our current life. It is not about what we have in our hands, but about the willingness to put it at the service of something greater. If we are ready, God can transform us into instruments for His work. For the people of Israel, Jael's act was a watershed. His action not only eliminated the oppressor, but began the liberation of the people who had been crying out to God for a long time. The victory over Sisera fulfilled the prophetic word given to Deborah, according to Judges 4:9, "For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." And that's exactly what happened. It was not a weapon of war that brought victory, but a stake in the hands of an ordinary woman. This act of justice and deliverance shows us that God does not need the obvious to act. In fact, He often uses the unexpected to carry out His plans, making everything more impactful and unforgettable. Jael was far from the palaces and the courts, far from the armies and the battlefield, but she was not out of God's purpose. Sometimes we think that we need to be in prominent positions or in places of influence for our lives to have an impact. But God, as we are taught in Proverbs 16:9, in his heart a man plans his way, but the Lord determines his steps. Jael did not need to change place, position, or context. It was there, in the tent, in your own reality, that it was used. This is a powerful lesson. No matter where we are, what matters is that we are ready for what God calls us to do. He acts in the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. By using a tent stake to defeat an oppressive commander, Jael transformed a symbol of domesticity into an instrument of divine justice. This choice reminds us of the words of Isaiah 55:8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. God does not think as we think, nor does he act as we would act. Often he takes what the world considers weak and worthless and elevates it to fulfill his purpose, showing that the power of his hand is sufficient to make anything useful. This is a truth we must guard. Nothing is small or insignificant when placed in God's hands. The tent stake in Jael's hands illustrates that in God's view, everything has potential. This act of courage demonstrates that even what seems insignificant to the world can become a powerful tool in the hands of someone driven by faith and obedience. Psalm 33:16-17 reminds us, no king is saved by the size of his army, no warrior escapes by his great strength. Sisera, even though he was a powerful commander, fell before a simple woman and a stake. What this event reveals is that for God, what counts is not human strength or weapons, but the heart willing to act according to his will. This moment of victory for Israel was also a testimony to all those who witnessed Jael's action or heard of it. The simple but decisive act of a woman transformed the course of a war. This example shows that in God's hands, anything, no matter how small it may seem, can become an instrument of transformation. Jael's courage, moved by her faith and trust in God, generated a definitive and unexpected change, which marked the history of Israel. His story continues to be a powerful reminder that, with God, anyone can become the instrument of his justice and deliverance. Jael's story is a living testimony to how faith and obedience can move mountains, transforming even the most unlikely of scenarios. When we find ourselves surrounded by opposing and oppressive forces, faith is often the only foundation on which we can stand. Jael, by choosing to ally herself with the God of Israel, teaches us that true obedience is one that is independent of what others may think. His decision undoubtedly went against the alliances and interests of his family and society. In Hebrews 11:6, we read that without faith it is impossible to please God. It was this faith that allowed Jael to act with courage, guided by the conviction that there was something greater at stake, a purpose that she may not fully understand, but that she accepted with confidence. Jael's courage was much more than a momentary act. It was the fruit of a life in which obedience was cultivated in every small decision. This teaches us something essential about the power of obedience. Often we want to see immediate results, but true obedience requires patience and trust. As Proverbs 3:5-6 shows us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Jael, surrounded by oppression, had every reason to back down or even conform, but her faith pushed her to trust that God had a plan for that moment and that her action would have a greater impact than she herself could have imagined. The people of Israel had already been living under oppression for 20 years, and the feeling of despair was constant. However, Jael shows us that obedience at a critical moment can bring a surprising turn. His decision to act reflects the same faith that led Moses to trust God as he led the Israelites out of Egypt. In Exodus 14:14, God says, "The Lord will fight for you, and you will hold your peace." This kind of faith, which believes in divine intervention even when the situation seems impossible, is what Jael demonstrated by placing herself as an instrument in God's hands. Every choice of obedience we make, especially in difficult times, is like a seed planted, which can later blossom into deliverance and righteousness. The political landscape was complex, and alliances often meant life or death. Jael's husband, Heber, maintained a strategic peace with King Jabin, whom Sisera served. However, Jael's faith was greater than political alliances. As Acts 5:29 teaches us, we must obey God rather than men. She did not hesitate to put God's will above human agreements, even though she knew it put her own life at risk. This obedience that defies human logic reminds us that loyalty to God's purpose must always come first, even when the world around us tries to impose a different path. Jael also shows us that obedience to God's will is not passive, but active and audacious. When we feel the call to act, it is not enough to just believe, it is necessary to do it. James 2:17 reminds us that faith, if it does not have works, is dead in itself. Jael listened and responded, putting her life in God's hands and taking on a role no one would have ever imagined for her. It shows us that true faith is not just an internal belief, but an external action that reflects confidence in the divine purpose. In our life, this can mean making courageous decisions in our work, in our relationships, and even in the way we help others, even when it puts us at risk. Jael's action in a time of oppression reveals that obedience often requires us to face our greatest fears. Faith in God does not eliminate our fears, but it does give us the courage to face them. This is what Psalm 27:1 reminds us, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, of whom shall I be afraid?" Jael, with faith and courage, faced the enemy face to face, trusting that God would be with her. This kind of courage can be cultivated in our own lives, in the way we deal with difficult and challenging situations. For Jael, obedience meant being courageous when no one else dared to be, and that made her an instrument of justice. With faith and obedience, Jael achieved what many thought impossible. Their attitude reminds us that obedience to God's principles brings results that go beyond what we can see. In John 14:15, Jesus instructs us, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Obedience to God's word is therefore a demonstration of love and faith, and Jael gives us a practical and powerful example of this. In our lives, obeying God may mean giving up something we value or acting contrary to what the world considers logical. When we follow this path, our faith is strengthened and brings us into alignment with the divine plan, bringing results that transform not only ourselves, but also those around us. Jael lived a faith that transcended his context, his limitations, and even his human alliances. This kind of faith is one that trusts in divine justice, even when everything around it seems to say otherwise. In Jeremiah 29:11, God assures us, "I know what thoughts I have toward you, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." Jael knew that by acting obediently, she was fulfilling a greater purpose, a purpose of justice and deliverance, and it is precisely this trust that encourages us to live a life where faith and obedience go hand in hand, knowing that God is ahead, guiding and protecting in every decision. Jael's decision to confront Sisera, even though he is one of the most feared commanders, shows a courage that goes beyond the simple desire for self-preservation. She welcomed Sisera into her tent, an attitude that might seem the surest choice for her own protection, but which turned into an unusual act of courage. This choice illustrates what Jesus said in John 15:13, "Greater love has no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Although Jael was not a warrior, she was willing to risk everything, even her own life, to bring deliverance to the people of Israel. This example of putting the good of one's neighbor above oneself echoes the sacrificial love that is so valued in Scripture. Sisera believed he was safe and secure in Jael's tent. After all, she was a woman, someone he would never imagine as a threat. In offering him refuge, Jael acted with a cunning that reveals how much faith can transform the way we face danger. She knew that even in a context of extreme tension and oppression, the divine purpose was present. As Psalm 91:4-5 says, "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will be safe. You shall not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day." Jael faced danger, protected by an unshakable faith, and the certainty that she was accomplishing something far greater than her own interest. By welcoming Sisera and deciding to eliminate him, Jael risked being seen as a traitor, especially since her husband Heber had an alliance with Jabin, Sisera's allied king. Jael's decision to go against the political alliances of his own household reflects the same spirit that Peter and the apostles demonstrated in Acts 5:29, when they said, "We must obey God rather than men." Jael knew that God's call overcame any human covenant, and that her obedience was a powerful testimony. This example challenges each of us to always choose God's purpose, even when our circumstances or relationships pressure us to do the opposite. Jael's act was an unexpected twist in the war against the oppression of Jabin and Sisera. In a context of 20 years of submission, the people of Israel longed for deliverance, and Jael answered that cry. Psalm 18:2 reminds us, "The Lord is my rock and my stronghold and my deliverer." Just as Israel found deliverance through someone no one expected, Jael demonstrated that even the most unlikely can be used by God to bring about freedom and justice. His action against the enemy commander was not only an act of personal courage, but a response to oppression, a proof that faith leads us to act for the greater good, even when we face danger. Sisera's presence in Jael's tent posed an absolute risk to her. However, she was not intimidated. He knew that this was the time to fulfill God's plan, and his confidence was rewarded with victory. As God tells us in Joshua 1:9, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Jael's courage came from his trust in the Lord, and that faith gave him the strength to turn a moment of danger into an occasion of deliverance. This conviction is something we can all cultivate, knowing that in any situation, God accompanies us and strengthens us. Jael's act, seen by many as an act of betrayal, was actually an expression of her loyalty to a higher purpose. She understood that the divine call to confront Sisera transcended any human allegiance or political understanding. Romans 8:31 says, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" Jael believed that by following God's purpose she would be safe, even if it meant standing against a powerful man and his alliances. His decision reflects the kind of faith that is not intimidated by external threats or pressures, but that stands firm, knowing that the path to justice may be risky, but it is always rewarding. Sisera trusted Jael to offer him protection, but it was this same trust that led to his defeat. By acting according to the divine plan, Jael demonstrated that faith also involves using wisdom and discernment to act at the right time. As Ecclesiastes 3:1 tells us, "Everything has its appointed time, and there is a time for every purpose under heaven." Jael knew how to wait for the exact moment and, by taking action, showed that his trust in God gave him the courage to act with precision. His strategic action serves as a reminder that faith, when combined with discernment, becomes a powerful weapon against any enemy. Jael's act was not only a victory over an enemy commander, but a spiritual victory for the entire people of Israel. Sisera, who had oppressed the people for so long, was defeated in a scenario that no one could have ever foreseen. This reminds us of what 1 Corinthians 15:57 says, "But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." Jael's victory was ultimately a God-given victory, and that victory brought deliverance, justice, and peace to the people of Israel. And so Jael's action leaves us with a precious lesson. God can transform the moments of greatest danger into opportunities for triumph when we act with courage and faith. Jael, by acting at the right time, fulfilled a role that was carefully aligned with God's timing. This divine precision shows us how God acts at times that to us may seem late or unexpected, but which are perfectly suited to his purpose. The people of Israel had been crying out for deliverance for 20 years, and Jael was used as an answer to that cry. As Ecclesiastes 3:11 states, "God has made everything beautiful in its due time." Just as God's timing was exact to deliver Israel in our lives, we must also trust that every event happens at the right time. God is never late. He prepares every detail so that when we act, it is effective and definitive. The choice of Jael as an agent of deliverance was something that no one could have predicted. The prophetess Deborah had announced that victory over Sisera would come at the hands of a woman, but not even Deborah knew that this woman would be Jael. God uses time and people according to his designs, surprising us with his sovereignty. In Jeremiah 29:11, God reminds us, "I know what thoughts I have about you, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." When we wait for God's timing, we find that He already has it all figured out, and that often His plan includes those no one would ever imagine. Jael's act was a perfect fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy, showing that in His time, God brings forth what He has promised. In Judges 4:9, Deborah had said, "The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Jael's intervention reminds us that when God promises, He delivers, even if the time seems long and the wait exhausting. Sometimes we are tempted to act on our own, rushing through the process. However, Jael waited for the right moment, and in acting, her action had a lasting impact. This is a call for us to wait patiently for God's perfect timing, trusting that His promises will always be fulfilled. The wait of the people of Israel was long and full of suffering, but God's time came in a precise way, with Jael being the instrument of deliverance. It is as Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait on the Lord, take heart, and He will strengthen your heart. Therefore wait on the Lord." Waiting on the Lord is a lesson in faith that requires patience and trust, even when the days are dark. Jael could have hesitated or questioned the moment, but she trusted, acted, and brought the long-awaited release. In the same way, we are called to trust that God's timing is always the best, and that in every situation He prepares a way out at the right time. Jael didn't know she was God's answer to Israel, but that didn't stop her from acting with faith and courage when the time came. Such is God's timing in our lives. We often don't know how our small action can be connected to something bigger. As Romans 8:28 says, "We know that all things work together for good to those who love God." Every act of faith, every choice of obedience is used by God for His greater purpose, even if we don't always see the whole picture. This understanding encourages us to act with confidence, knowing that God orchestrates every detail for a greater end. Jael's role in Israel's deliverance was also a message for future generations, reminding us that God's timing is always sovereign. His action was decisive, but the impact of his act continued to be remembered and celebrated. As Habakkuk 2:3 says, "For the vision is yet to be fulfilled at the appointed time. Hasten to the end and will not fail. Even if it tarries, wait for it will surely come. It will not tarry." This promise echoes in Jael's story, showing that God's plan is fulfilled fully and at the right time, even if in our eyes He seems to delay. Our confidence in His timing is therefore an expression of faith and patience. Jael's action, so awaited by the people of Israel, happened at the exact moment that God had determined. It was like a key that unlocked the future of a people who cried out for liberation. The victory was proof that God's timing never fails and that He is faithful to fulfill every detail. As we see in Isaiah 40:31, "But those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and shall not be weary. They shall walk and shall not faint." Israel had to wait, but that wait was rewarded. Jael was the instrument that brought the answer to the cry of an entire nation, and her action teaches us that there is great power in trusting in God's timing. This deliverance, which seemed distant, became a reality with the intervention of Jael, proving that God does not forget the cry of His people. In Judges 5:24, Deborah and Barak celebrate Jael's courage. "Blessed be Jael, the wife of Eber the Kenite among women." This exaltation was not only an acknowledgement of his heroic act, but a celebration of God's perfect timing in delivering His people. The wait, as long and difficult as it was, brought a victory that would never be forgotten. Jael not only brought justice, but also an eternal testimony that when God acts, He acts at the right time, and the wait is always worth it. Jael's story shows us that true faith can take us to places we would never have imagined. What profound lessons we can draw from this woman who, without pretensions, changed the destiny of her people. Have you ever stopped to think about the opportunities God puts before you, even in the most ordinary, everyday situations? Jael's example is a powerful reminder that anyone can be an agent of change, as long as they are willing to act with courage and obedience. Now look at your life and think, Where could you act with more faith and courage? In what areas do you feel that God is calling you to a greater purpose, but that you may have hesitated? Often it is necessary to take a first step, to trust that God has already prepared the way. If you want to continue learning about deep topics like this and discover new ways to grow in your faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's go on this journey together.